where we've explored the wonders of the natural world, and we have all relied on its great abundance for our food and livelihoods. And yet, all too often, it can feel distant and disconnected from our everyday lives, allowing us to forget just how vital it really is.
At 6:30 in the morning, Prince William opened an envelope that would shatter everything. Within seconds, he collapsed. The palace went into lockdown. What was in those genetic test results about Prince George that made a future king fall to his knees? By 8 a.m., King Charles received one chilling message. It concerns George. For centuries, the royal family buried a dark secret in their bloodline.
The truth is that healthy oceans are essential to all life on Earth. They generate half of the world's oxygen, regulate our climate, and provide food for more than 3 billion people.
But modern science just exposed what they've been hiding. The DNA results are confirmed. The truth is irreversible, and what they reveal about the next king will change the monarchy forever. According to palace sources, the envelope was unremarkable in appearance. Standard cream paper, heavyweight stock, with only the royal cipher pressed lightly into one corner. It passed through 3 handlers before reaching Prince William, who was already awake. Those who knew him well had noticed he had been sleeping poorly for weeks, though few understood why at the time. William was standing by a window when he opened the envelope. The winter light was just beginning to filter through the bare trees outside. The document inside was structured like most medical reports, with sections confirming the testing methodology and authentication protocols. But somewhere in the 3rd paragraph, the findings were stated plainly. Prince George carried a rare inherited genetic marker that had appeared sporadically throughout royal history, though it had never been properly identified or understood until now. The physical reaction was immediate. William's knees gave way before he had fully processed what he was reading. The envelope fell from his hands and scattered across the carpet. A senior aide in the corridor heard the sound of someone falling and rushed to the room. By 7:15, the palace physician had been called. Half an hour later, Catherine was brought in, though she had not yet been told what had happened. By 8 o'clock that morning, King Charles had been informed, with a brief message over a secure phone line. The words were simple, but carried enormous weight. It concerns George. But the story does not begin that February morning. To understand how genetic testing came to be performed on a future king, we need to go back several months earlier, to a conversation that took place in late October of the previous year. At that time, the palace was dealing with what staff described as a period of heightened concern. The king's regular health reviews had become more frequent. William's schedule had tightened considerably around his children, particularly the older ones. There was a general sense among senior advisors that the future was arriving faster than anyone had anticipated, though no one spoke about it directly. It was during this period that a senior medical advisor, someone who had served the royal household across 3 different reigns, requested a private meeting with the Prince of Wales. The meeting was scheduled as routine, but it was anything but. The advisor was known for being careful with his words. He had spent decades protecting information rather than revealing it, so when he spoke, people listened closely. The advisor explained that while reviewing long archived biological records related to historical royal health issues, he had noticed something concerning. There was a pattern, he said, that appeared in the records at various points across centuries and then seemed to disappear, as though someone had deliberately obscured it. He was clear from the beginning that this was not about scandal or affairs or questions of legitimacy. This was about medical history that had never been properly understood. He asked William a direct question. Did the prince believe the royal family truly understood its own medical history? William did not answer immediately. He had learned that sometimes silence reveals more than interruption. The advisor went on to explain that certain traits historically attributed to stress, weakness, or difficult personalities did not match what modern medicine now understood about inherited conditions. These traits had been mislabeled for generations, he said, partly because genetic testing had never been allowed to advance far enough within the royal family. Until now, there had been no way to know for certain. The advisor made it clear that no one was suggesting any wrongdoing. This was about knowledge, he said. Knowledge that could matter for the health and safety of the next generation. William asked the question that was already forming in his mind. Was this about George? The advisor hesitated. That hesitation would later feel more significant than any words that followed. He explained that Prince George had undergone routine pediatric screenings recently, as all children do. One of those screenings had returned what he called a minor irregularity. Nothing alarming on its own, he emphasized. But when that irregularity was compared with the patterns in the historical data, it formed a picture that could no longer be ignored. William did not agree to testing immediately. He asked practical questions. Who would know about this? How would the data be protected? Could the results ever be used against his son in any way? The advisor answered each question carefully. The testing would be conducted privately through discreet channels. The data would remain sealed. The findings would be shared only with William, Catherine, and the king. There would be no public disclosure unless it became medically necessary. What the advisor could not promise was that once such knowledge existed, it could ever truly be buried again. The testing that was eventually approved required permissions that did not exist on any official paperwork. Samples would need to be collected discreetly. The analysis would involve genealogical comparisons reaching back across centuries of royal history. This was not a single test, but a series of tests conducted across multiple independent laboratories. None of those laboratories would ever appear in any official record. William took the information home that night. He went to George's room and watched him sleep. He observed the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way his small hand clutched the edge of his blanket. He thought about lineage not as crowns and ceremonies, but as responsibility passed quietly from one generation to the next. When he finally gave his consent to proceed with the testing, it came with one absolute condition. No one else would be informed until he knew the results first. The samples were collected under the cover of routine medical reviews. Catherine was not told about the testing until after the process had already begun. When she found out, her reaction was not what William expected. She was not frightened. She was angry, not at the test itself, but at the realization that questions about her child's body had been asked and investigated without her knowledge. She demanded answers that could not yet be given because the results were still being processed. The weeks that followed were difficult. It was not the anxious waiting of uncertainty. It was heavier than that. It was the kind of waiting that happens when you already sense what the truth will be, but you are not ready to face it yet. The medical advisor checked in occasionally during this period. His tone remained measured, perhaps too measured. By early December, the first preliminary results arrived. They were incomplete but consistent across different laboratories. They suggested that whatever they had found was not random. It was inherited. At that point, King Charles was informed. The conversation between father and son was brief and unusually devoid of ceremony. The king asked if the child was in any danger. William said that no one knew yet. Then the king asked a question that surprised William. Has this happened before? The advisor later confirmed that it had. Not once, not twice, but multiple times across royal history. The marker had always emerged in early childhood. It had always been managed quietly, and it had always disappeared from public memory through various means. Medical records were reassigned or relabeled. In some cases, the truth was simply buried under strategic silence. What made George's situation different was timing. Modern genetics could no longer look away from what earlier generations had chosen to ignore. By January, the full genetic sequencing was complete. The findings were reviewed and independently verified by specialists who did not know whose DNA they were analyzing. Each specialist returned the same conclusion, phrased in careful academic language that nonetheless carried unmistakable weight. Prince George carried a rare inherited genetic marker associated with a condition that had been historically misunderstood and deeply stigmatized within royal tradition. The condition was not life-threatening. It did not impair intelligence or affect life expectancy, but it challenged something the monarchy had relied upon for generations: the idea of unbroken physical perfection as proof of divine right and continuity. The advisor explained that in earlier eras, children with similar markers had been quietly redirected away from the line of succession. Their traits were explained away as personality quirks or temporary illnesses. Records were altered. Stories were rewritten. The crown endured because the truth remained fragmented and scattered across different archives. This time, fragmentation was impossible. The science was clear and documented. William read the preliminary summary alone one evening in late January. Catherine sat nearby, pretending to read a book while watching his face change as he moved through each line. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but firm. They cannot take him. The advisor had anticipated that reaction. He explained that no one was suggesting removal from the line of succession. The law was clear on that point. There was no constitutional mechanism to alter succession based on genetic information. But law, he reminded William, had never been the only force governing the monarchy. Perception mattered, tradition mattered, and fear mattered. Fear was already moving quietly through rooms and conversations where it had no name yet. The final comprehensive report was completed in early February. It was sealed with the highest level of confidentiality and sent to Kensington Palace. That was the envelope that arrived at dawn. That was the confirmation that turned possibility into documented fact. What broke William was not the science itself. It was the realization that the palace had known this could happen. That somewhere in locked archives, decisions had been made to protect the institution at the expense of children who could not defend themselves. William collapsed not because of what his son was, but because of what the crown had been willing to erase. And now the truth had found its way back into the blood of the future king. This time there would be no erasing it. By the time the immediate shock of the genetic results had passed, the palace found itself operating in two completely separate realities. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Daily briefings continued as scheduled. Public engagements were planned months in advance. Prince George continued to attend school, smile for cameras, and wave with the easy confidence of a child who had no idea that his name was at the center of private discussions happening behind closed doors. But inside those closed doors, nothing felt stable anymore. That second reality lived in files that were never printed, in conversations that happened only after mobile phones were surrendered and rooms were checked twice for listening devices. It existed in the careful avoidance of certain words. No one wanted to say condition, defect, or weakness out loud. Instead, people spoke around the subject using phrases that sounded technical but revealed their discomfort. It was King Charles who finally insisted that the evasion had to stop. He had lived long enough to know that unnamed fears were always the most dangerous. 3 days after William's collapse, he convened a private council. The meeting included only the most senior advisors, people who had been with the family long enough to understand that some conversations could never leave the room in which they occurred. The king asked his advisors to stop circling around what everyone was thinking. He put it directly. Is this about succession or survival? No one answered immediately. From a purely legal standpoint, the situation was straightforward. There was no constitutional threat. No statute existed that would allow genetic information to alter the line of succession. The monarchy had survived abdications, scandals, wars, and periods of exile. It could survive this too. But the king was not asking about law. He was asking about belief. For centuries, the crown had relied on a sintoam, narrative that was never fully articulated but was deeply assumed. That continuity itself was proof that the blood of monarchs carried something rare, stable, and chosen. This story was reinforced through ceremony, symbolism, and most importantly, through silence about anything that contradicted it. The narrative did not need to be spoken because it was simply understood to be true. Now that assumption was under serious strain. The medical advisor who had initiated the testing explained the situation more fully to the council. The genetic marker identified in Prince George was not unknown to modern science. Medical professionals understood it as a neurological variance that manifested differently depending on environmental factors and support systems. In contemporary terms, it was recognized as a difference, not a deficiency. But in earlier centuries, it had been described very differently. Historical records used words like fragility, volatility, and in some extreme cases, moral, failing. The language used to hide it had shifted across different eras, but the intent had remained the same. Control the narrative, preserve the image of perfection. What troubled William most was not how the palace might react to this news now, but how it had reacted in the past. He made a request that caused visible discomfort among the senior officials present. He wanted access to the restricted archives that documented historical cases similar to George's situation. The request was unusual. Those files were not meant to be revisited. They represented choices that modern sensibilities would not easily forgive. Several advisors exchanged glances, but the king, after a long pause, approved the access. When William began reading through the archives, he felt as though he were walking through a gallery of ghosts who had never been given names. The files were not explicit. They did not need to be. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. There were references to royal children who had been removed from public view with vague explanations of sudden illnesses. There were records of quiet relocations to estates abroad with no follow-up documentation about what happened to those children later. There were medical notes that used careful euphemisms where proper diagnoses should have been recorded. There were letters between monarchs and their closest advisors that discussed children not as people, but as problems, as liabilities that needed to be managed for the good of the institution. None of the records stated things directly. That was part of the strategy. By keeping everything vague and scattered across different archives, no single document told the full story. But when read together, the documents revealed a pattern of systematic exclusion. Catherine read the files alongside William. She grew progressively quieter as she turned each page. At one point, she closed a folder firmly and said something that William would never forget. They survived by sacrificing their own. That sentence changed the nature of every conversation that followed. This was no longer just about managing a medical disclosure. It had become a moral question about what kind of institution the monarchy wanted to be going forward. The palace was now faced with a choice that history had avoided by obscuring it. Would they continue protecting the institution at all costs, or would they redefine what strength meant in a modern monarchy? Internally, the advisors began to split into two camps, though no one acknowledged the division openly. One group argued strongly for absolute privacy. They insisted that disclosure of any kind would invite scrutiny not just of George, but of every royal birth that came before him. They warned of endless media speculation, potential legal challenges from distant relatives, and most importantly, the erosion of the mystique that had always protected the monarchy from too much public examination. Once you start explaining, they argue, you never stop explaining, and every explanation diminishes the crown. The other group took a different position. They argued for what they called controlled transparency. They believed that secrecy was no longer a viable strategy in an era where information surfaced eventually, regardless of official permission. They pointed to numerous instances where attempted cover-ups had caused more damage than honest disclosure would have. They also emphasized something important. Prince George's condition posed no actual threat to his capacity to rule. He was intelligent, healthy, and developing normally in every meaningful way. Honesty about his genetic makeup could actually strengthen public trust rather than weaken it, they argued, by showing that the monarchy could adapt to modern understanding. William listened to both sides carefully. He attended multiple meetings where these positions were debated with increasing intensity, but he felt a strange distance from both arguments. He realized that neither side was asking the question that mattered most to him. What would George want? That question began to haunt him. He would lie awake at night, imagining his son growing older and eventually discovering that his own family had spent months debating whether his biology made him acceptable as a future king. He imagined the damage that knowledge could do. Not the genetic condition itself, but the knowledge that the people who should have protected him had instead questioned whether he was good enough. The more William thought about it, the clearer his position became. This was not about public relations strategy or constitutional law. This was about whether his son would grow up knowing he was fully accepted, or whether he would spend his life sensing that something about him had always been considered a problem to be managed. King Charles watched his son struggle with these questions and recognized something in William's face that he had never been allowed to express, himself during his own years as heir. It was doubtful. Not doubt about duty or commitment, but doubt about whether tradition always deserved to be preserved simply because it was tradition. For the first time in his reign, the king allowed himself to question whether continuity required sameness, whether strength had to mean uniformity, whether the crown could survive being held by someone who did not fit the unspoken ideal of physical and neurological perfection that had never actually been defined but had always been assumed. The conversations between father and son during this period were different than they had been before. They were more honest, more willing to name things that previous generations had refused to acknowledge. The confirmation that would eventually be announced to the public did not originate as a press strategy worked out by communications professionals. It began as an ethical reckoning among people who had to decide what they believed about power, legacy, and responsibility. The palace legal team warned that any statement would need to be extraordinarily precise. Every word would be analysed and interpreted. Terms like confirmation, review, and assurance would need to be chosen with extreme care. There could be no mention of specific genetic details, no medical labels that could be researched and sensationalized, no history lessons about past cases. The statement would need to say something while revealing almost nothing. But William insisted on one specific inclusion. The statement had to explicitly affirm Prince George's full standing in the line of succession without any qualification whatsoever. It could not be buried in the middle of a paragraph. It could not be hedged with diplomatic language. It had to be clear and direct. This demand was not universally supported. Several senior figures expressed serious concern that such a declaration would actually invite more questions rather than fewer. If you state something that no one was questioning, they argued, people will assume you are responding to hidden doubts. The statement would create the very problem it was trying to prevent. William responded with a sentence that effectively ended that particular debate. If we do not say it plainly, people will assume we mean the opposite. As drafts of the statement began to circulate internally, the tension inside the palace grew sharper. Staff members who were not fully briefed sensed that something significant was happening. Security protocols were quietly tightened, conversations became shorter and more guarded. People's eyes lingered on closed doors, trying to read situations they were not part of. Outside the palace gates, nothing appeared different to the public or the press. Photographers still gathered for scheduled appearances. Reporters still filed their routine stories about royal engagements and fashion choices. But inside, every conversation carried extra weight. Every decision felt consequential in ways that were difficult to name. The so-called bloodline question was no longer theoretical. It was not an abstract debate about policy or protocol. It had become intensely personal, deeply political, and completely irreversible. And at the center of all these adult anxieties and institutional calculations stood a young child who knew nothing of genetic markers, historical patterns, or questions of worthiness. He knew only that his father looked at him differently now, not with less love, but with something else layered on top of it. A fierce protectiveness mixed with an unspoken grief. Because William understood something that the palace was only beginning to accept. The crown could survive the truth. The institution would not collapse under the weight of honest disclosure. But survival was only possible if the monarchy stopped being afraid of its own history and started being honest about its future. The question was not whether Prince George could be king. The question was whether the crown was ready to be held by someone who represented a more complete version of human experience than the narrow ideal it had always pretended to uphold. William had always imagined that breaking would be dramatic. He thought it would involve shouting, doors slammed hard enough to echo through corridors, voices raised in rooms where centuries of portraits watched in silent judgment. He imagined anger taking visible form, or defiance that would finally force history to confront something it had been avoiding. What he did not expect was how quiet it would actually be. The breaking happened on an ordinary afternoon in mid-February. By that point, the palace had returned to what looked like carefully rehearsed calm. The statement about George's genetic results was still being refined, with advisors debating the placement of commas and the implications of specific word choices. Outside the gates, journalists sensed that something was happening, but could not yet identify what it was. Inside, William sat alone in a small private room that was rarely used for anything official. There were no files spread out in front of him, no medical reports to review, no draft statements to edit. Just a single photograph that he had taken himself several years earlier. George at 4 years old, laughing with his head thrown completely back, utterly unguarded in that way children are before they learn to perform for cameras. William stared at the photograph longer than he realized. What finally undid him was not fear about the throne or the future of the monarchy. It was grief for a childhood that had already been altered without his son knowing. A childhood that was now invisibly threaded with adult anxieties and institutional calculations that George was too young to understand or consent to. He thought back to the moment he had agreed to the genetic testing. At the time, he had told himself it was the right decision. It was about protection, about medical foresight, about love. Now he could see the other truth more clearly. By agreeing to that test, he had invited the crown into his son's body. He had allowed the institution to claim a part of George that should have remained private and protected. That realization left him feeling hollow. The palace physician had cleared William physically after his collapse. The diagnosis had been straightforward enough: acute stress, exhaustion, dehydration, nothing that proper rest and care could not address. But there was no medical language for what was happening to him internally. William was not ill in any conventional sense. He was unraveling. Catherine noticed it first in the way his presence changed during evenings with the children. He would sit beside her on the sofa, but he was not really with her. His eyes followed George, Charlotte, and Louis with an intensity that went beyond normal parental attention. It bordered on surveillance. When George scraped his knee during play, William reacted as though it was something catastrophic. When George grew quiet while reading or drawing, William would search his face for signs of distress that were not actually there. One night, Catherine placed her hand over William's and said something gently but firmly: "You cannot protect him by watching him disappear." That sentence landed harder than any briefing or advisory meeting had. It forced William to confront what he was actually doing. In trying to protect George from everything, he was making his son into an object of constant scrutiny rather than simply allowing him to be a child. William began to pull away from palace advisors after that. Scheduled meetings grew shorter. His responses to questions became clipped and minimal. When pressed to make decisions about how to proceed with the public statement, he asked for more time. Not because he genuinely needed additional information, but because he feared the moment when time would run out and decisions would become irreversible. King Charles observed all of this with a familiar ache. He recognized the posture, the withdrawal, the quiet desperation. He had warned himself decades earlier when confronted with choices that pitted the needs of the institution against the well-being of a child. He understood what his son was going through better than William probably realized. The king requested a private meeting, not a formal audience between monarch and heir, but a conversation between father and son. They met without any staff present, without papers or official agendas, without the usual ceremony that governed their interactions. The king did not begin with reassurance. He did not offer platitudes about duty or strength or the importance of legacy. Instead, he said something William never expected to hear. "I failed you in ways you were never allowed to name." William looked up sharply at that. The king continued speaking. He talked about his own childhood, shaped by rigid expectations and institutional silence. He spoke about moments when his own vulnerability or emotional needs had been treated as inconveniences rather than legitimate human experiences. He described lessons learned far too early, that love within the monarchy was conditional even when people pretended otherwise. He did not make excuses for any of it. He simply named it as truth. William felt something inside himself finally give way. He began to tell his father what he had not been able to tell anyone else, including Catherine. He said that his greatest fear was not scandal or negative press coverage. His greatest fear was repetition. He could see with frightening clarity how easily the palace could rationalize decisions that harm children while simultaneously convincing itself that it was acting responsibly and in everyone's best interest. He feared that one day, years from now, George would sit across from him and ask why his father had not stopped it, and William would have no good answer to give. The king listened without interrupting. He let his son speak until there were no words left. When William finally finished, his voice broke, though not into tears. It broke into something colder and more determined. "I cannot let them turn him into a problem to be solved." That statement marked a turning point. When William stood up from that meeting, he was different than when he had entered. He was still shaken, still exhausted from weeks of poor sleep and constant anxiety. But something had hardened in him. A line had been drawn internally, and it could not be erased or negotiated away. He returned to Kensington Palace and immediately asked to see the most recent draft of the public statement. He read it slowly, once, from beginning to end. Then he read it again, more carefully. On his third reading, he took a pen and crossed out an entire paragraph. The advisors who had worked on the draft protested immediately. They warned that removing that language would leave the statement too exposed. It would invite interpretation and speculation. rather than containing the narrative. The paragraph William wanted to remove had been carefully constructed to provide context without revealing specifics, to acknowledge concern without confirming vulnerability. William responded with unusual calm. Containment is what caused this. He then rewrote the central passage himself, not in the cautious legal language that palace statements typically employed, and not in medical euphemisms designed to obscure meaning. He wrote in plain institutional clarity. The palace confirms that recent genetic analysis concerning Prince George has been reviewed and verified. These findings do not alter his health, his future responsibilities, or his place in the line of succession. No elaborate explanation, no apology, no careful justification for why the testing had occurred in the first place. When the advisors objected again, pointing out all the questions this approach would leave unanswered, William looked at them steadily and said something that seemed to chill the room. If we speak as though there is something to forgive, people will assume there is something to fear. That night, William finally slept for more than a few hours, but his dreams were restless and strange. He dreamed of long corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow his movement. He dreamed of doors that opened onto rooms filled with children whose names had been deliberately removed from historical records. He woke before dawn feeling unsettled. He went to George's room, moving quietly so as not to wake Catherine or the other children. George stirred when his father entered and opened his eyes. He smiled when he saw William standing there. Then he asked a simple, direct question. "Why are you so sad?" William sat carefully on the edge of the bed. For a moment, he considered how easily he could lie. He could say he was just tired, or worried about work, or dealing with grown-up problems that George did not need to think about. All the comfortable evasions that adults use to protect children from uncomfortable truths. Instead, he chose something different. Not the full truth, because that would have been too heavy a burden to place on a child, but honest truth, measured appropriately. "I'm not sad about you. I am fierce about you." George seemed to accept this answer with the easy trust that children have before the world teaches them to be suspicious. He rolled over and went back to sleep within moments. William stayed sitting on the edge of the bed until the sun began to rise outside the window. By mid-morning, the final version of the statement was ready. It had been reviewed by legal advisors, medical consultants, and communications professionals. Everyone had added their input, though William's core language remained unchanged. The king received the final draft and read it without expression. Then he simply nodded his approval. He offered no commentary, no suggestions for revision, no warnings about potential consequences. Just a nod that said this is acceptable. The palace released the statement shortly after midday on a Wednesday. The reaction was immediate and intense. News outlets scrambled to pass the limited information provided. Headlines appeared within minutes, some measured and some sensational. Confirmation without context read one. Royal health mystery read another. What the palace is not saying dominated afternoon broadcasts. Commentators speculated wildly, trying to fill the vacuum of information with theory and assumption. Social media platforms churned with competing narratives, invented histories and passionate reactions from people who had no actual knowledge of the situation, but strong feelings nonetheless. But beneath all that noise, something unexpected began to happen. A quieter response started to emerge. Parents who had children with genetic differences spoke up. Educators and medical professionals who recognized the language of variance rather than defect added their voices. Advocates for people with neurological differences saw something in the statement that others had missed. They heard not a scandal being managed, but recognition finally being offered. William watched the coverage unfold with guarded attention. He did not feel relief exactly, but he felt something he had not felt in weeks: alignment. The breaking had not destroyed him. It had clarified something essential. He now understood his role more clearly than ever before. His job was not to protect the crown from truth. His job was to protect his son from the crown when necessary. And that understanding, painful as it had been to reach, would change everything that came after. The palace had issued confirmations before: deaths, engagements, illnesses, births. Each one carefully calibrated to reveal just enough to satisfy the moment, while preserving institutional calm. This confirmation was different from the instant it was released. It was shorter than people expected, flatter in tone, and notably absent the usual softening language that cushioned uncomfortable truths. That absence was deliberate. Within minutes of the statement going public, senior royal correspondents began calling their contacts inside the palace. None of those calls were returned. Medical commentators analysed the phrasing, looking for clues that simply were not there. Constitutional experts read and reread the line about succession, as if repetition might expose some hidden caveat. It did not. The palace had confirmed 3 things and refused to elaborate on any of them: that genetic analysis had taken place, that it had been reviewed and verified, and that it changed nothing about Prince George's future. By refusing to explain further, the palace had done something unusual. It had forced the public to confront its own assumptions about what royalty was supposed to be. Speculations surged precisely because details were withheld. But as hours turned into days, the narrative began to fracture. Without a central story to cling to, the noise could not sustain itself. Each theory contradicted the next. Each expert undermined another. What remained consistent was the one line the palace refused to soften: Prince George's place in the line of succession remains unchanged. Behind the scenes, the confirmation triggered a second wave of internal reckoning. King Charles convened one final council, not to debate the statement, but to discuss what came next. He spoke plainly. The palace would not issue follow-up statements. It would not grant clarifying interviews. It would not provide background briefings to trusted journalists. Silence would be maintained unless the welfare of the child demanded otherwise. This decision unsettled those who believed institutional authority depended on constant explanation and narrative control. But the king had come to understand something William already knew. The more the palace spoke, the more it invited distortion and speculation. William was not present at that council meeting. He was at home with George, helping him with homework that had nothing to do with history or monarchy. When the call came confirming the public release of the statement, he acknowledged it briefly and returned to the kitchen table where his son was working on mathematics problems. George looked up and asked what confirmation meant. William paused, choosing his words with care. It means that sometimes grown-ups tell the truth without telling a story about it. George nodded as if this made perfect sense and went back to his work. What the palace had confirmed was not a diagnosis or a weakness or a scandal. It was an end to a particular kind of denial. For generations, the monarchy had relied on silence to maintain the illusion that the crown was untouched by the full spectrum of human variation. That illusion had been punctured, not by scandal or exposure, but by simple acknowledgement. The confirmation did not specify what the genetic marker was or what it meant in medical terms. But it did something more significant. It implied that such variations had always existed within the royal bloodline. Advocacy groups began drawing connections, not to George specifically, but to patterns throughout history. They questioned how many stories of difficult heirs or fragile princes had been shaped by misunderstanding rather than actual incapacity. The palace did not respond to any of this emerging conversation. Internally, some staff members struggled with the shift. Those who had built entire careers on managing narratives felt unmoored by the refusal to engage. Others quietly expressed something close to relief. One junior aide remarked to a colleague that for the first time in memory, the palace sounded like it was telling the truth without asking for permission first. William received messages he never anticipated. Letters and emails from parents whose children had been quietly excluded from opportunities because institutions could not accommodate differences. Notes from adults who had grown up believing something was fundamentally wrong with them because the world around them insisted on narrow definitions of acceptable. He read them alone, late at night after the children were asleep. None of them mentioned thrones or crowns. They mentioned dignity. The confirmation had shifted something fundamental. It reframed strength not as uniformity, but as the capacity for continuity through difference. The monarchy had not collapsed under the revelation. It had absorbed it, though the absorption felt heavy rather than triumphant, because confirmation carried responsibility that could not be avoided. Months later, on an afternoon in early March, when winter was beginning to loosen its grip, George asked William a question while they walked through the palace gardens. "Will I still be king someday?" William did not hesitate. Yes. There was no explanation attached to the word, no conditions, no reassurance beyond the simple truth of it. George accepted the answer. easily and immediately began talking about something else entirely, the way children do when their questions have been answered to their satisfaction. That ease was precisely the inheritance William wanted to preserve. Not perfection, not the weight of institutional expectations, but the fundamental knowledge that nothing about George made him less worthy of what lay ahead. The palace began to recalibrate quietly in the months that followed. Not through public announcements, but through internal practice. Language shifted in documents. Training programs expanded to include awareness that had not existed before. Advisors were brought in not to manage differences, but to understand them. The institution adjusted without fanfare. It was not perfect, and never would be, but it was moving in a direction it had resisted for centuries. King Charles watched this transformation with mixed feelings. He understood that something had been lost with the old illusions about royal perfection and divine continuity. But he also recognized that what replaced those illusions was sturdier. Legacy no longer meant unbroken sameness. It meant continuity with truth intact. Years from now, historians would debate the significance of that February statement endlessly. They would argue whether the confirmation marked a weakening of the monarchy or its modernization, whether the silence that followed was strategic brilliance or fortunate accident, whether the institution had genuinely changed or merely survived another challenge. None of that would matter to William. What mattered was simpler and more immediate. His son would grow up knowing that nothing in his genetic makeup made him less capable or less worthy of the responsibility that would one day be his. The future king would not inherit a throne built on denial. He would inherit one that had finally learned to exist with truth. The revelation that endured was not about collapse or crisis. It was about corrections, about an institution finally acknowledging what it had spent centuries trying to hide. That the crown had always been held by human beings with the full complexity that comes with being human, and that perhaps strength had never really been about perfection at all, but about the courage to continue despite imperfection. The silence that followed the confirmation was not empty. It was deliberately shaped and held in place by choice rather than fear. Inside that silence, William rebuilt something quieter and more durable than certainty. He focused on ordinary rhythms, school mornings, bedtime routines, questions answered without evasion but also without unnecessary weight. George sensed the shift in his father without fully understanding its cause. William laughed more easily now, not loudly or dramatically, but with genuine presence rather than distant worry. For the first time in generations, the path to the crown would not require pretending to be something other than fully human. And in that small but significant shift, the monarchy found not its ending, but perhaps its most honest beginning.